morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by Supply Management Insider in partnership with Oliver Wight, Sustainable Business Improvement Leaders. My name is Will Green, and I'm News Editor at Supply Management. In today's webinar, we'll be looking at supply chain management. Is it time you evolved your approach? The current COVID-19 crisis is a major test for traditional supply chains, and the desire to improve service while reducing costs and inventory is greater than ever. In this webinar, we'll be asking whether it's time to evolve your approach, and we'll look at the skills and systems needed to do so. We'll also explore why supply chains require improved visibility across the extended horizon and not just inside the cumulative lead time, in order to meet the requirements of an ever-changing environment. I'm delighted to be joined by two experts in the field. Andy Haynes, former Procurement Director at Heathrow and Network Rail. Andy has more than 20 years' experience transforming supply chains, collaborating to deliver major capital programs and working with suppliers to create sustainable solutions. And Neil Hill of Oliver Wight. With nearly 30 years of experience, Neil's background is in the implementation of continuous improvement methodologies. He has facilitated multi-million-dollar savings whilst creating impressive growth and profitability. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for joining us today. If you have any questions for Neil and Andy, we'll have some time at the end for a live Q&A. So do get yours in at any time using the comments box below the video player. Please note you may need to exit full screen to do this. The webinar will also be available on demand from tomorrow, so do share with your colleagues, rewatch, or catch up on anything you've missed. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Neil to get us started and set the scenes for today's webinar. Over to you, Neil.
Great, thank you, Will. So thanks for joining online. Appreciate your time and energy. I know the world today is somewhat challenging with all the things we're dealing with. So it's with pleasure that I'm kind of here to talk to you today about some of the thoughts around integrated end-to-end planning of our supply chain and the evolution of those supply chains. So I guess the real position to start from is what is the problem that we're dealing with, and what's preventing us from developing and managing our supply chains in this integrated end-to-end format that many people talk about, but actually struggle to realise the concept and the requirements to bring that to life and truly see the benefits from it. So we're going to think about this in the blocks of process, people and behaviours, and then tools and systems and data. And we'll just talk through a few of the challenges that we see today and maybe then how we can address some of those. So if we think about processes of today and the things that constrain us, very often our processes have evolved over time based on geographic hubs or role profiles where people are constrained by theoretical boundaries. When we think about extending our view into an end-to-end format, we really need to be thinking beyond the physical entity of the building we sit in or the reporting structure under which we exist. And that really then starts to test and challenge things like decision-making authority. So where are the decisions in your supply chain and across your supply chain genuinely made? And does the organisation, the process and the structure allow us to really take that into scope and manage that effectively? And what we find very often is that the processes create this kind of small picture thinking context, where actually we operate within the boundaries that have been created by our process and by the scope and span, and therefore never really are able to expand outside of that box and really understand what's going to be required to bring this kind of integrated end-to-end to life. Now, sitting on top of that, obviously, if our processes aren't kind of expansive and aren't thinking into that space, the people that we need and the skills and the way we behave has to evolve also. So very often our traditional mindsets are anchored to the seats within which we sit, the roles with which we play, and actually the skills that we've got are around managing that small bubble rather than thinking across the expansive. So really investing in the skills and the capabilities that are required, often in a space that hasn't been invested in over time, and really understanding the people that you're going to require to work the new process, work the new world that you're trying to design. So I guess one of the key questions that I'd ask you is, when did your children ever say to you, when I grow up, I want to be a supply chain professional? It just doesn't happen. It's vets and doctors, etc., etc. So in our world, we need to make this a career, and we need to make it a professional discipline, which is starting to happen, but it's still early days, I guess, in our experience. So driving that kind of the knowledge and the capability around behaviours and people is important. But we also then need to have access to systems and data and information that spans outside the traditional boundaries of the single site instance of our ERP planning system or distribution planning system, out into the further horizons, and thinking about end-to-end management without boundaries across the nodes of our supply chain. So architecture, or traditional architecture based on, I don't know, mergers, divestitures and acquisitions will have a part to play. And often something as, what seems fairly straightforward as data accessibility and quality can be a real inhibitor, where we've got different kind of data structures and master data across different instances and parts of our supply chain that are not able to interact. So we can visualize, but we can't access the data and we can't use it effectively. That slows everything down. So they're a kind of a flavor of some of the key issues we see in terms of us being able to realize this end-to-end structure and format. But I guess one of the key challenges is understanding what we're designing for. So in our world, in my world, supply chain and the design of supply chain strategy is our strategic response to the commercial strategy and objectives of our business. So think of supply chain as the vehicle to unlock the value that is being described and generated commercially through portfolio and our marketing organisations and our ability to go to market. So it's critical that we understand in a top-down format what does success look like and what are our customers willing to pay for and what do they value. If we have that clarity where we can look across our supply chain node, so from tier 2 suppliers, so raw material providers or external service providers, right the way down to the connection to the end user and all the nodes in between that make up that sequence of activities to bring that service or product to life, then we can start to think about what do we design, or how do we design our overall supply chain response to meet those values. So top-down strategic requirements, defining what our customers value, and then will help us decide how we organise to create this optimized value chain response to meet that individual segment's requirements. So driven through consumer behaviors or buying practice or decision making, really important that we anchor it back to the commercial objectives and structure that we're trying to realize. I guess if we've got to this point where we understand strategically what we are trying to organize and design for, we understand what our customers value, what's important, and what drives differentiation for us, with regard to our performance against competitors, then we can start to think about organizing our resources to deliver against those propositions. And when we think about resources, there's the context of what we physically own, plus also what we employ from third parties or the channels we transact through are all part of this network design and concept that we need to consider. So it's important that we are understanding what we have today versus what we need tomorrow, and understand how we then generate this evolution roadmap based on the requirements that we've defined as part of this strategic supply chain kind of alignment and definition. But I guess the one thing that has been visible, more visible in the last couple of months really, is that the implications of hardwired, hard-coded supply chains and how much they can inhibit you from responding to or delivering against an opportunity that arises in the short term. So if you think about your supply chain as a series of reconfigurable nodes, the challenge is how do we do that effectively and in a time-bound fashion that allows us to respond to the changing environment that's around us or that we're projecting, and optimize accordingly. So think about this like, for example, a telephone network. So back in the 1920s, whatever, Single line, 2 points hard coded. Then we went to a manually managed plug and play kind of connection to bridge the network, to then digitize switching, etc., to reconfigure all of those points of connection that we need in a real-time fashion. So our supply chain needs to emulate that to a degree, and we need to understand what do we need to own, what do we need to lease, buy, where does it need to be, and how do we evolve that over time to create this both strategic roadmap and sort of the evolution roadmap, plus also our investment profile that says what are we going to need to do over time to really maximize the opportunity and benefit that we see in front of us. I guess when we've got to this point where we truly understand customer value and the offering, we understand how to connect that through our network and through the sequence of nodes and structures across our network. The challenge then becomes really going back to the conversation around processes and technology and data around how do you connect all that and span that architecture of your supply chain in a way that bridges the traditional boundaries of ownership and relationship. So when we think about maturity and our ability to realize that end-to-end governance, management, interaction, and kind of agile flexibility that we've described, we really need to think about the processes that span that, the tools and data sets that allow us to bring that together in a seamless fashion, and also the people and skills that we require as we go through this journey of maturity to really think in that broad and expansive way, which traditionally is not how we've brought supply chain professionals up and have given them that space and scope and context to manage. And again, you look at the supply chain that is described on the screen in front of you. It's a fairly common traditional view, but this could apply to any form of configured supply chain. So it could be, I don't know, someone like Wayfair who are offering this integration platform where providers and entrepreneurs are using it to connect and create this bridge across the supply chain. So it's really important that we understand that, we can see it, we can visualize it, we connect it with both process and tools and allow access to data, but also that we allow collaboration and decision making across that supply chain to take place, and that we remove the traditional boundaries of ownership, of sensitivity, of legal boundaries in terms of legal entities in regions. Where is decision making really taking place, and how do we bring that to life is a key question. So if we're able to describe and design around an orchestrated structure, what we are able then to do is think about over time, as things change, how do we run various scenarios around our network to think about the what ifs of this world. So if things change, what do we need to do? So what's required now, future, long range, what have we got that are fixed or semi-fixed, and how can we remove some of those constraints? So do I really need to own physical real estate? Do I physically need to own production facilities and processes? Or actually, is it about configuring other people's assets to give a bigger value proposition? I can really then start to think about the strategic opportunities that are in front of my business and being a first adopter or a first scene setter on driving that value and opportunity, and also then being able to model and understand vulnerabilities in the process and thinking about our continuity planning or risk management approach to dealing with those. So, would we have really run desktop and scenarios around something like COVID-19? Yeah, we should have done. Would it have been as expansive? Would it have covered all the variables? Would it have been of high nature in terms of the impact of something? Maybe not. But actually, we could have practiced and built some skills around the what if and what is likely to happen that we would need to respond to. So that approach, again, we can do in collaboration with our supply chain partners. So if things happen in certain regions, how would we respond as a network rather than as an individual company? And drive that real understanding. But what we also need to really be clear on is when we want to make these changes, what are the decision-making horizons that are driving those changes? So how quickly do I need to make the decision, or how quickly can I enact that decision and that change? So really understanding that is critical. And I guess in the same way that we've described through many of the other slides, our ability to connect this together with some integrated systems and approach. So whether that's concepts of machine learning and AI to try and drive some of this scenario activity is critical. but may unlock some of the value that we can't get to when we're thinking about it from a human perspective. When we're also talking about networks, remember we are talking about not just the supply nodes, but also everything that makes up our offering. So the order to cash cycle, it's all about back office, administrative support, so invoicing, accounts payable, accounts receivable, all has to exist in that kind of new world. And so things like, for example, blockchain may unlock a load of that kind of capability that allows us to realize and see some of those benefits. It may not, but what we need to do is work out what is the applicable approach for us as an organization and as a collaborative supply chain to really drive that value. I guess that agility and responsiveness, really actually to companies is a strategic advantage. So if genuine customer value is at the heart of the way we are perceiving, reflecting, designing, creating, and managing our supply chain response, then actually we will be at the forefront of the commercial world and our competitive world. But it also allows us to integrate all of the things around financial projections, risk management, and really understanding the true implications on our business of all the different options and scenarios we've got to play, rather than just thinking about a P&L or a balance sheet within an individual physical entity or legal entity, for example. So that removal of boundaries is critical. What we do know, though, is that people don't like change, and this is a fairly straightforward change equation that many of you will have seen. So Beckard-Harris model. So dissatisfaction times vision times first steps needs to be greater than resistance to change to activate change. So our job as leaders within supply chain is to really describe the dissatisfaction and the vision around moving from the siloed approach of today to this integrated, expansive, collaborative world of tomorrow. And I guess the one thing that we do know from the crisis we've seen over the last couple of months is that, as Plato's kind of reflection on necessity as a mother of invention, dissatisfaction and vision has been driven hugely by the issues associated with COVID-19. And we've seen some things that you would never, ever have dreamed possible only 3 or 4, 6 months ago. So collaboration and relationships between people like Apple and Google, commercially would never, ever have existed in the same space, let alone talk to each other. Significant shifts in portfolio in companies. So in order to respond, so the emotional response plus also the commercial need to survive, moving from aerospace into respirators, from garments and fashion into PPE, all of those things and collaborations that you would never have dreamed possible, all start to come to life because there is a dissatisfaction and a vision that we're doing something greater. So our job is to bring that to life. And I guess even down to things like, the legislative organizations around the world. So FDA in America, for example, I have one client who's had a new product signed off and approved from start to finish by the FDA in 3 weeks. If you'd have gone back 4 months, it was 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So to get that done in this environment is critical. So our job, I think, coming out of this is to realize and understand what benefits have come from it that we need to capture and embed within our philosophies for the future. So realize the benefits of the world that's been created today. So key that we understand that and we drive that change and we are cognizant of it. But I guess, in summary, the real kind of success and exceptional performance comes from really, taking the time, creating the context and structure to understand what our customers value, understand what the differentiators are for them and for us, and then understanding and define our business strategy in a way that is more than just 10% growth annually, to really drive our activities and focus the investments to deliver the benefits we're looking for. It's about thinking beyond the constraints of today. So if we always look at it through today's lens, we'll always get the same answer. So it's taking a step back and thinking about the art of the possible, not reflection on the impossible. And I guess that acceptance of change, that change happens, I guess there are 2 mindsets in this world. There's one that responds to change as a threat, and actually you're minimizing the damage of that change. Or there are those that actually see it as an opportunity and a real kind of amplifier or injection of energy into the process and go out to win and optimize against that or deliver the opportunity. So really it's about a mindset and a behavior and the way we orchestrate and align to deliver against those opportunities. So that's kind of pretty much my space. It's we've got a lot tried to cover a lot in a fairly short period of time, but hopefully that's given you a context of this connection of customer value and understanding the drivers, understanding that our job is to organise in the optimum way, but there are boundaries that constrain that and drive this forward, and then really leveraging that in terms of delivering for the future. So that's me. Thank you. Will.
Thanks, Neil. That's fascinating. It sounds like you were suggesting perhaps that, or maybe I could suggest that perhaps people got a bit complacent in terms of their strategies.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, it's an interesting concept. I guess at times we can become too familiar and too comfortable with what we know. And I guess the risk there is that we become organisationally blind to the things that are either going to impact us or the opportunities that are in front of us. And we become entrenched in our traditional views and thoughts. So I guess a large proportion of this to me is about unlocking the parts of our skills and behaviours and knowledge that don't always get brought into the conversation, and really leveraging that to look at the art of the possible outside of the constraints of what we have today. Because at the end of the day, the things that constrain us are money and time, right? With endless money and endless time, I can do whatever I would like to do. So our job is to work out the best way to optimize those variables to deliver against this value opportunity.
And of course, so traditionally, it's been a big challenge for sort of procurement and supply chain professionals to get buy-in from the rest of the business for these sorts of strategies and to invest in these sorts of strategies. But perhaps this new normal that we're under will sort of give impetus to people pulling together in this regard.
Well, I think your point. It starts to break. It has to start to break down the boundaries that have existed between the functional silos of our business. Even if we are thinking globally and internationally, there are still silos and behaviours that constrain us. So I guess the context of today's world is we've had to break a load of those down. And what were traditionally, concrete paradigms have had to be broken down for both survival of people, the emotional sort of clinical side of things, plus also the economic side of it from businesses and nations, because what we're dealing with is fairly unprecedented, but the response has been tremendous. But it's required people to go against the things that they would normally be bouncing up against. And that influencing upwards, the supply chain or the procurement professionals trying to influence senior behaviour and the way that we construct our business offering, the commercial offering, really is a challenge. So to us, it's about the business understanding where it needs to be and understanding who are the partners in delivering that jigsaw. So the orchestration of a sort of a harmonious ecosystem across the business, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I just want to remind our listeners that you can pose your own questions, so please do. And I'm now going to hand over to Andy. We've had a sort of strategic overview from Neil, and now Andy is going to put a bit of context on that and give us some real-world examples of how this can work. Over to you, Andy.
Great. Thanks, Will. Good morning to everybody. And thank you for staying in and listening to Neil and I on this lovely sunny day. Neil's spoken about how to go about evolving your supply chain approach. And I'd like to support that with some ideas and illustrations from my role as Procurement Director at Network Rail and Heathrow, where I worked for about 20 years with some fantastic, excellent professionals. And I was able to learn a lot from them. So I think now more than ever, as Neil has suggested, supply chain professionals need to be ready for anything. By which I mean, you have to put in the normal hard work to understand your environment, develop your supply chains, but more than ever, you need to be able to pivot quickly, and as Neil suggested, introduce new nodes to be able to react to different internal and external factors. So the internal factors could be a new corporate strategy from your CEO, or perhaps a safety incident that changes the way you operate. And the external factors, I think, as we're seeing right now with this COVID crisis, the climate emergency that is with us and getting ever more important, or indeed something like a drop in oil prices, depending on what your business is. So I guess the contention with my talk is that these impacts to the supply chain and the operation of your business are not going to go away. COVID is just one example of a major global kind of issue affecting everything that we do and the way we operate. So that we need to be able to react more quickly about deconstructing and rebuilding, changing out our supply chains than we've ever done before. So the point here, I guess, is that without doing that, the kind of worst case scenario probably for your business and for you personally is to go the way of the dodo. You become extinct. The best opportunity, I guess, the very best thing that can happen if you don't react in the right kind of way is that you have a very kind of unimpressed CEO or CFO who don't think you're making best use of the resources that's at your disposal. So hopefully that was enough of a call to action to say, yes, we need to evolve our supply chain. We need to do things differently. And I'm just going to spend the next 15 minutes or so just talking about my experiences, principally at Heathrow Network Rail, and colouring some of the things that Neil has mentioned. Network Rail suffered kind of an existential crisis of punctuality, delivering great service to its operational customers and passengers, and needed to change. And equally at Heathrow, it needed to change the way it operated to show that aviation could be a sustainable kind of business. So if we just take the next slide. We can keep things fairly simple in that most things, however you look at it or review it, resolve into the people you've got in your team and how they operate, the systems that you've got and the processes that you use. And so in the next few minutes, I'll just talk a little bit about how you can get those ready for the new reality. You can't have a strong procurement team without the right kind of people. And however much we automate what we do, which is going to be increasingly necessary, if you haven't got the right people with their own strong network and ability to influence in the supply chain and also throughout your business, they're going to be isolated and ineffective. Equally, if you've got systems that give you poor data and the wrong kind of visualization, it's going to lead to the wrong solution. So in the cartoon here, if you get the wrong correlation, you're going to get the wrong solution. So while sunshine leads to lots of ice cream eating, it also leads to sunburn. But because you eat ice cream when you get sunburn, it doesn't mean that the two are correlated. So your systems have got to be set up to give you the right kind of insight into what's going on. And equally, your processes need to be resilient enough to maintain their outcomes throughout their life. With the illustration of this pencil that delivers the wrong message as it gets increasingly used. So I think it's important that we work from more or less first principles to review what we're doing and how we're doing it before you take action about training your people, buying systems, or reviewing your processes. And as the old adage goes, management is about doing things right. Leadership is about doing the right things. And this talk is about doing the right things. So just have the next slide. So I think the executive committee of any business, I think, expects more from the procurement team than most other functions. They expect to see plenty of magic and eye-catching initiatives. So the supply chain team are there to maximize value within a risk and assurance framework. And it's entirely within your gift to decide what that risk and assurance framework looks like in order for you to deliver maximum value. All CPOs, I think, need a mental structure, an ideal, if you like, to think about how their business operates. So what I'm offering up today is my own kind of six-step structure for helping you think about how you review and evolve your supply chain. Those 6 points, as the slide shows, fit neatly, hopefully, into the people, systems, and processes structure we talked before. And so the next 6 slides, I'll just talk a little bit about how those can be brought to life and how you should be regularly reviewing your operation in light of those 6 elements. So let's have the next slide. So right at the very heart of any business is establishing the purpose values and ethos of your business. So effectively, these are the touchstones about why and how you go about doing your business. So why are you doing it, and what is the essence of doing that business? So if we take Heathrow, for example, the change it was making was about greening the brand, demonstrating that in its widest sense that the aviation sector can be sustainable. And the way it did that was to describe in great detail its sustainability strategy. It was called Heathrow 2.0. And out of that came about 25 different initiatives that had to be applied to the supply chain. And so making sure that your team and your systems and processes support the delivery of that change of approach is absolutely essential. So, for example, the circular economy was a very important aspect of how we did business. So we had a very comprehensive logistics setup for our construction materials. But what we were able to establish is that there are people out there that will take that redundant material and repurpose it. And so in one example, we repurposed lots of equipment we wouldn't use that was actually perfectly good, and it was sent on its way to Africa so that we could allow people to use that equipment and to be retrained for their own benefit. And that became a core part of how we wanted our suppliers to work with us to think about how we could maximize those opportunities to create a circular environment. Another core part of the Heathrow ethos was the idea of the living wage, and in Heathrow's case, the London living wage, where everybody at Heathrow, including all of the staff involved in the supply chain, were paid instead of the minimum wage of about £8.50 an hour, they were paid £10.50 an hour. And this was because it was important for us to demonstrate that Heathrow is a high value employer, and that the work people were doing was useful work and high value work. And so we were determined to make sure that by the end of this year, everybody across the campus and the supply chain was paid at a higher rate and was doing high value activity. So that was just two examples of 20 odd different initiatives that had to be driven into the supply chain by the procurement team and connecting with the absolute purpose and ethos of the business to do it. And in many ways, the supply chain team become the most fundamental believers of this, because they've got to figure out what these values are and articulate them clearly so you can get them into the supply chain. So that is a huge effort to be able to make sure that we can drive those behaviours into the supply chain, and it's the first of those 6 steps. So we just go on to the next one. So Neil also mentioned, what are the value drivers of the business? So how does it create value? How does it go about turning its services into value? So both at Heathrow and Network Rail, customer service was at the forefront of how we derived value. So if we take Heathrow, looking at the idea of a frictionless airport was absolutely key, with much more self-service activity, and this idea of the vision being the concept of operations in 2030. So where are we going to get to in the next 10 years? So procurement's part in this was to understand how the business wanted to develop value, and to engage with the operational teams and also the supply chain to make sure that we brought the very best market knowledge to bear. So to illustrate that, how do you get a frictionless airport? Well, instead of buying perhaps cheaper check-in desk staff and reducing cost, or even having much fancier check-in desks with more expensive people behind them, what we did was actually make sure that people could do self-boarding or self-backdrops. So it was about investing in technology. So actually, we don't need the people. What we need is the way for the customer to have a seamless and easy as possible kind of journey through the airport. But what that meant was, instead of buying people, we bought high technology. So the supply chain for that activity, that value stream, fundamentally changed from one about employing people and putting them through customer service routines to one of where we were searching the globe for the very best technology, systems, algorithms to be able to give us that seamless supply chain. So the team changed their focus of what they had to buy and how they had to buy it, and obviously procurement were played a pivotal role in that seamless journey. Coincidentally, it's also a very effective way at social distancing in the current times, and similar to, I guess, what TfL did with their Oyster cards in the early 2000s. But key to that is you need people that are able to partner with sales and finance teams to synthesize real-time single source data, and not stuff that you just get from your procurement system. So the point here is that we need to make sure that our systems, as well as telling you the things that the traditional procurement team needs, are also embedded into and feeding off your sales system and also your finance team's ledgers. So you actually get the single source of truth about what cost is. And at the airport, for example, whilst the airport provided the desks, it didn't provide the people. So the value proposition spanned not only the infrastructure provider, but also the airline and both supply chains. So to get the right approach, to get the right understanding of the value drivers, you have to talk with the airlines, our own operations team, and the supply chain to figure out what the end-to-end cost was, what people valued. So again, we're back to a team that are able to understand complex issues and also to influence their stakeholders to get the right result. We just pass on to the next slide. So Neil also mentioned this idea of an ecosystem. So this is the idea of what do things look like right now, and it remains an extremely powerful way of looking at things by drawing fairly simple diagrams. So one of the skills that we need with our teams is to turn the complex into the simple, because if it's not simple, you're unable to articulate it to a wide range of stakeholders. So here is a simple example of the passenger journey at an airport, the customer's trip from arriving at the airport through checking in, going airside, and then indeed returning again and collecting their bags and returning. So that's a pretty, about as simple as you can get it, to say the passenger's journey at the airport looks like this, with the blobs representing the size and value of certain contracts. So it's enormously powerful to be able to visualize what your value stream looks like, in this case the customer value stream, what suppliers are involved in that, and indeed what other parties and what internal teams are involved, so you can have a proper conversation about the total cost of ownership and the total cost of, or the total value of ownership as well. So it's only if you lay out things end to end, I guess this looking beyond the normal horizon, you can actually see where value lies, and whether it's I guess a service supply chain or indeed a production supply chain. Diagrams like this can show you where inventory builds up and waste occurs, and you can think about driving that out. The other reason for having a good visualization of your ecosystem is that in any reasonably complex business, you will look at things in different ways. So as I've said, this is an example of the passenger journey. There were also the bag journey was also a way that we looked at deriving value, and finally the operational journey of a plane. So the kind of three core operational activities of the airport was the passenger journey, the bag journey, the plane journey. But our organisation didn't necessarily fit that simply. We looked at effectively a commercial team that looked at sales, an operations team that ran things, and then a team that looked at the future. And so we had a number of examples where car parking is a good one, for example, where the sales and commercial team would look at how much things cost to the customer, and the operations team, a completely separate organisation, would actually run that operation, even though there was one supplier doing all of it. And so you tended to get inefficiencies in the handoffs between the teams. And so when we ran a tender to relook at all the car parking across the whole of the airport, part of procurement's role was to get the commercial teams and the operations teams to think about how they wanted to see that ecosystem work, and was there a better way of organising it both to the suppliers and also internally. And I'm pleased to say that we were influential in making sure the whole thing, the end-to-end process, became more efficient. Okay, so we just pop on to the next slide now. Right, so having done all of that really hard work, if you can't bring great facts, great data to bear, create a strong challenger statement, perhaps to change people's perceptions and ideas of how they go about things, it will all have been a waste. So perhaps the number one people skill that we've got, the new people skill, is being persuasive and having the ability to create a diverse network of people. So, you know, these cartoons here are showing the different ways that your team are going to have to be able to interact, not only in the traditional way that we've done things in procurement, but also interacting with a wide and diverse virtual network, strong interpersonal skills, and strong presentation skills to wide groups. And this I think will become the foundation of an evolved procurement team, new sets of skills which are much softer to be able to convince people of the right way of doing things in order that we can drive out this best value. So, you know, the key role of your CPO is making sure that your people are heard and your ideas get delivered. You could call it, if you like, a zippering approach. So, you know, the CPO deals with the executive committee and the board, and all the way down to your heads of department, and in fact, the people that actually do the work. They all need to have their key relationships zippered up so that you've got a good, strong network to be able to influence and deliver that best value for the business. Okay, let's pop on to the next slide. So the last couple of points in the 6-step plan is, so having done the homework, having developed your influencing skills, you now have to actually bolt this thing together, creating the enterprise to create this new evolved supply chain. And so we need to make sure that we have looked across that extended horizon to make sure that what we are delivering fits for now and the scenarios that we plan future. So at the beginning, I said that we need to be nimble and able to deal with whatever things throw at us. And you need to construct your enterprise in that way. Both at Network Rail and Heathrow, we were very supportive of initiatives or a movement that the Institute of Civil Engineers developed called Project 13. And this was all about how do you get your, in this case, capital suppliers more invested in your business cases and more able to support you in a very collaborative sense. And the simple way that we thought about it was that, you know, instead of just letting contracts, what you're doing is you're creating an enterprise. And I think this applies equally to, if you like, the normal operational part of running a supply chain as well as the capital part. Your key suppliers will be key partners with value and knowledge of their own. And the way you need to set up your agreements and management arrangements is as an overall enterprise aiming to bring value to your business rather than suppliers that just do as they're told. You know, even something as simple as a stationery supplier can give you some great feedback about you know, the paper supplies that you've got. Where do they come from? Are they able to trace that they come from sustainable forests? And what sort of paper do you want to use to maintain your brand, but also to show that you've got quality recycling activities? And that equally applies to complex capital projects where, you know, you want your suppliers to bring knowledge to bear to help you. A tunneling supplier is more likely to know a lot about tunneling than somebody that runs an operation, for example. So the key point here is that correctly constructed enterprise treats suppliers as equal partners. And at Network Rail, you know, we had lots of challenging discussions with our suppliers. People like the rail vehicles that we used, effectively the JCBs on rails. We had an extremely knowledgeable supply chain that would challenge us as equals about how we want to operate them, how we wanted to get them to site, what the safest way of doing things was, which often incurred more cost but improved the safety. So the opportunity to have good, challenging conversations that change the specification of what you want is really important, and to make sure that your relationships are set up in that balanced way. And I've got a picture there of Mace receiving an award for sustainability because they were able to bring ideas to bear from elsewhere around the globe directly to Heathrow to help us improve how we ran that very important greening of the brand and sustainability activity. So this is all about making sure that we've got a strong enterprise, and in your key contracts, they are treated as equals, not simply as suppliers that do as they're told. And this will improve your ability, I think, to be agile and deal with things that come at you both internally and externally. So if we get on to the sixth and final part of it, maintaining the enterprise. So having done all of that great hard work, figuring out what the issues are, setting up your enterprise, being able to influence across your business, if you don't put systems in place that help you run that effectively, all of that would have been for nothing. So here's an example from Oliver Wright of how you run your management business review with the right kind of systems and indicators. You've got to have the right level of management information. Too much blurs you. You've got to find out what the key performance indicators are. And what you should set up is for your key suppliers is how do you demonstrate that you're offering optimum value? It's a very broad question, but your system should be able to say, for the spend we've got, we're monitoring these 20 key suppliers, and this is how I can show you they are offering optimum value. I've run a number of concessions, for example, where if you just look at the profit margin that concession is earning you through their operation, it looks okay. But if you don't really have good data about how they're marketing, what the market size is, are they getting, how much business are they getting, you don't know whether they're being run very efficiently. And both in Network Rail and Heathrow, we've had examples of where if you don't monitor the right things, whilst things look as if they're deriving value, you're losing value. So it's extremely important that you've got some systems that you can rely upon that tell you the right key data to be able to demonstrate to your board and exec committee that you're getting the right kind of value. So we just go on to the last slide in kind of summary and bringing it together. The summary really is that now is the right time to evolve your supply chain. I think you may or may not agree. We'll have some questions, I think, in a minute about, I think the nature and pace of change coming at us internally and externally is only going to increase. And therefore, if you are not looking fundamentally at how you operate your supply chain now, then you're likely to go the way of the dodo. The good news is it kind of always boils down to what kind of people do you need, what kind of processes do you want to run, and what systems do you need to run that. You need to do some good base activity to get the right answers for that. But your systems need to be aligned with the value drivers of your business. Your processes need to be set up to let your suppliers be equal partners. And perhaps most importantly of all, your team skill set needs to evolve. I think we've got teams that are perfectly capable of running very good procurements, but we now need to make sure that we're looking at the front end. What is the problem statement? Have you engaged your operational teams in understanding how the business operates and how the supply chain can affect it? And at the back end, have you made sure that when you hand things over to the operation, you've got a management system that tells you that you're getting optimal value? So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the last 15 minutes or so, and I'll hand back to Will to engage a bit of Q&A.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that fascinating insight. It seems like, well, you mentioned the enterprise approach, Project 13, and then the need to get sort of buy-in from the rest of the business and softer skills. How much do you think people are going to need to sort of change as procurement professionals in terms of their softer skills to enable these changes to take place?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty fundamental change. I think Neil mentioned it as well at the top of his discussion. Things often are set up in the way they've kind of fallen over the last few years. We've really got to put in some effort to say to our procurement colleagues, the things that you used to do that got you promoted and got you praised, running great procurements, are a baseline, but it's not enough anymore. We need to have people that understand how that operates, but can also convey that simply upstream to be very, very influential with their operational peers and also the senior management and the executive committee. So the ability to come up with a good argument supported by data and deploy it in a presentation or a one-to-one or through a range of stakeholders is going to be absolutely key, because without that, we're not going to be able to unlock the value of the supply chain.
Neil, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess the other thing, building upon Andy's kind of words, I guess it's one thing us driving for this knowledge and capability within the working layers of the business, but we also have to have an exec organisation that is comfortable with devolving that responsibility and feeling that actually it's enriching and empowering and growing the contribution of both internal resources and external resources. Andy talked about building this, the ecosystem, but actually that ecosystem spans across lots of geographies and physical, financial ownership. So our organisation and our kind of leaders also need to be comfortable with, letting that kind of decompression of the organisation and decision-making process take place as well, because that's going to free up a huge amount of activity, because they can't be involved in every single decision every minute of the day, especially when you're on a 24/7, 360 globe kind of organisation, business and world.
Right. Okay. Well, before we get to the Q&A, we'd like the listeners to take part in a poll for us. So the first question we would like you to answer for us is, what do you see as the biggest barrier preventing you from unlocking the true potential of your supply chain? Your options are A, clarity and integration of your long-range commercial strategy; B, a traditional approach to organization structure and supply chain footprint; C, integrated systems and access to quality data; or D, skills, capabilities, and understanding of the people across the end-to-end supply chain. The second question we'd like you to answer is, after today, what will be your first step to evolve your supply chain management? Your options are A, review the contribution your suppliers make to supporting your purpose and values; B, discuss with your customers how suppliers can improve their value proposition; C, create a more detailed picture of the ecosystem at work in your supply chain; or D, put more focus into the management of your key suppliers. Please get involved and share your opinions. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll come back to the results shortly. Now, don't forget to submit your questions for Neil and Andy at any time using the comments box. To anyone asking, the webinar will be available on demand 24 hours after the live session finishes. You can share it with colleagues or rewatch it at your leisure. Now, let's have a look at the questions we have so far from our audience. Please keep sending yours in using the comments box underneath the slides. Right, so we've had a question come in, and it's about, I suppose, sparked by the current crisis. Is there going to be a move away from just-in-time and offshoring? Neil, would you perhaps want to answer that?
Well, so I guess the challenge is, if you go back to some of the content of the discussion, we've created a response or a supply chain structure that is driven by the things we know, tradition and the behaviours and the life that we know. So COVID-19 and any crisis of that nature creates disruption, and our job is, when we think about supply chain strategy, is to predict, I suppose, consider and organise to deal with that disruption. So that could be, the just-in-time mentality may be actually I need to think about just-in-time that is sourced from a more local kind of context, but actually that I can reconfigure. We talked about this telephone network exchange kind of discussion. If I get a disruption in one part of my organisation that is traditionally a deep sea source, that's been driven by cost, and actually, what would I do if there was an issue there? So this continuity planning, risk management, looking at the art of what could be is really where this is. So I don't actually think per se we'll say it's not just in time, it's not offshoring. It's going to be more about, if I'm going to do those things, what are the risks that are associated with them, and how would I respond if something changed that meant they were no longer viable or acting in the way that I needed to them. So to me, it's about this continuity, dynamic continuity planning across our supply chain strategy and our business as a whole. So it's resilience, I guess, is the conversation. Not we'll do none of that and none of this.
Andy?
Yeah, well, I suppose the question hinges on, do you think we're going to have another COVID-like incident, emergency? I think the answer is yes. So I think we're becoming less and less tolerant of things that perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago we would have just kind of got on with. Hence hence the sort of lockdown that we're having right now. So I think these things are going to happen, and we're going to become less tolerant of them. So it's not as if this is something that's happened once and will go away. I suppose the answer will be onshore, will be around risk and value. So I can imagine that if you're manufacturing your PPE in Thailand and each item is 10% cheaper than it would be than doing it in the UK, you'd probably reshore. If you're buying complex manufactured parts that there are no suppliers for in the UK, and it's a high value item, you probably won't do it, but you'll probably need to wrap around it some strong risk mitigation and some strong indicators of what to do if another incident hits us. So I suspect that people will weigh up the risk and value. Things that were marginally better with a longer supply chain may well come back onto UK shores.
Right. Okay. Another question we've had is around how the value that supply chain managers bring is calculated, and the question seems to be: does this need to change how performance is measured in terms of not limiting it to the economic value, but total added value instead of total cost of ownership? What would you say to that, Andy?
Yes, I mean, interestingly, both at Heathrow and Network Rail, and we had some good, strong measures of cost reduction. They seem to be quite objective and metricatable, but a number of our initiatives meant that we were putting cost into the supply chain to improve the service levels, and that's obviously a lot more difficult to measure. I think where you want to get, I can't necessarily give you an answer. It does need to change. What you've got to have is the trust of the exec committee and the advocacy of your customers. However, so you do that, reducing cost, being quick, being super helpful, delivering great suppliers. It's a combination of all those things, but what it all ends up in is what is worth measuring, I think, is the advocacy of the senior team and also of their teams. And it's important for us to keep a very kind of close understanding of how that is working, because it'll be very difficult to kind of measure in a simple way all of those factors. So I would prompt to say, yes, we do need to measure things a different way, and it all ultimately resolves in: does the exec committee have confidence in the team, and do the customers in the operations and elsewhere enjoy great customer service from your team?
What are your thoughts on that, Neil?
Yeah, I guess, emulating Andy's kind of comments a little bit, but also sort of expanding. I guess one of the key challenges is supply chain as a concept and as a profession, as a discipline, is undervalued in my opinion. I would say that because I'm a supply chain person, but the reality is often it's an afterthought. We've designed commercially where we want to be, etc., and then we expect the supply chain organisation, with the assets and resources it's got deployed, to respond in what actually are unmanageable times or experiences or expectations. So I guess some of it is about bringing and recognising that supply chain professionals have a huge part to play in the overall success of the organisation. So being able to link that contribution to overall commercial success is critical. Very often the symptoms of our businesses' inefficiencies manifest themselves in supply. So poor performance, quality, cost, whatever that might be. But actually, when you dig into the source of that variation or the source of that issue, it's very often not the supply chain organisation that has generated the cause. So Andy's causal effect kind of discussion. So I guess going back to the comments in the slides, if we understand the value we're trying to deliver and we free up our supply chain professionals to configure that in a way that makes sense and optimizes, actually then you drive a higher level of value, and it isn't just about tangible, tactical performance measures. It's about contribution to the overall commercial offering. And if you think about what Andy was describing about mobilising all of these cross supply chain resources outside of your job, so the collaborative ecosystem, the value that's there is huge, and the knowledge that's there is huge. But linking back to Andy's comments about where do you go for information? How often do you go back upstream to suppliers to say, what do you see in all the other competitors who you deal with, who I'm working with or working against? So I think it's really finding the supply chain a seat at the table, valuing what it can bring if you engage it effectively, and lifting the conversation up above the tactical measures.
Right. Well, that leads on to our next question, and I think our final question, in fact, which is, when will senior leadership start bringing in procurement and supply to a major board position as a structured and integral part of its resilience methodology? What do you say to that, Neil?
So when should they have, or when are they going to?
When will they? Yes.
Yesterday, and as quick as I can. Obviously, the only decision I can make is now. So to me, if there isn't a seat at the table, if supply chain and the supply chain organisation isn't fundamentally at the heart of conversations, you will always be sub-optimising, because much of the I guess much of the magic that we see in supply chain, where they're able to respond to all sorts of challenges that get thrown at them, is because we've had to build contingency into our design or our offering to try and absorb that variation. Now, some of that variation we can predict and we can span for that, but actually a lot of it is stuff that we just had to put some safety margin in. Now that costs us money. So unless I anchor and connect supply chain into the heart of the commercial discussions, that we are able to talk about, we could organise the supply chain in this manner, and this is what it would deliver from a customer perspective, that true value proposition, then actually I'm kind of screening out half of their contribution, half of the knowledge and context they can bring to the discussions. So to me, it's why didn't you do it yesterday conversation, not we need it tomorrow or the month after. This is fundamental to our long-term survival, and if you're not doing it, you have a big problem.
Right. What are your thoughts on that, Andy?
Yes, I would completely echo what Neil says. As he says, if you haven't got those conversations at the top table, you are undoubtedly leaving value opportunities kind of going begging. I think the key factor, so when will people do it? Obviously, lots of businesses have supply chain directors and procurement directors sitting at the executive level, or indeed at the board level. I think the difference between those that are enlightened, if you like, and those that aren't, is a level of maturity to be able to have the difficult conversations where your supply chain director is discussing with your ops director the inefficiency of the ops director's business, or perhaps vice versa. And unless you're mature enough to have that kind of conversation to drive out value in a sort of properly cabinet kind of sort of way, the business is not going to be running as smoothly as it might. Right.
Okay. Well, that brings the webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone who's taken part and who's listened in. Now I'm afraid you'll have to we'll have to take our leave. But thank you, Andy and Neil, for taking part and sharing your expertise. And thanks to our audience for listening. The webinar will be available on demand, so please do share with your colleagues. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. Thanks for hosting us, Will.
Pleasure.